New York City's agreement to pay $5.9 million to settle a lawsuit over Eric Garner's death came almost a year after Mr. Garner's fatal encounter with the NYPD in Staten Island. Here's a look at other key moments in the year since Mr. Garner died.
This is a terrible tragedy that occurred yesterday, a terrible tragedy that no family should have to experience.
Eric Garner died July 17, 2014, after a police officer who suspected him of selling loose cigarettes subdued him with a chokehold.
In attempting to take Mr. Garner into custody, there was a physical struggle, during which Mr. Garner repeatedly complained of difficulty breathing as the officers wrestled him to the ground.
Commissioner Bratton announced the following week that the police department would retrain its officers in the use of force, a move he said could take years. Funeral services for Mr. Garner were held on July 23rd. On August 1st, the New York City medical examiner ruled Mr. Garner's death a homicide, citing compression of the neck during his arrest as a cause. Patrick Lynch, president of the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association, said Mr. Garner had resisted arrest.
We will defend these police officers. We will get experts in the use of force. This was not a chokehold.
On August 23rd, thousands marched in Staten Island to protest Mr. Garner's death. The rally came just 2 weeks after Michael Brown, an unarmed 18-year-old black man, was shot and killed by a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri.
We are not against police. Most police do their jobs, but those that break the law must be held accountable just like anybody else.
A Staten Island grand jury decided December 3rd not to indict Officer Daniel Pantaleo in Mr. Garner's death. The decision sparked demonstrations in New York City and around the country. More than 300 arrests were made in New York City over 2 days of protests. Mayor de Blasio drew praise and criticism the day of the grand jury's decision for remarks he made about Dante, his teenage son.
Because of a history that still hangs over us, the dangers he may face, we've had to literally train him, as families have all over this city for decades, in how to take special care in any encounter he has with the police officers who are there to protect him.
Also on December 3rd, then U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder said the Justice Department would launch an independent civil rights probe into Mr. Garner's death. On December 20th, 2 New York City police officers were killed by a gunman who ambushed their patrol car in Brooklyn. The accused gunman, who killed himself, had cited the deaths of unarmed black men at the hands of police.
Today, 2 of New York's finest were shot and killed with no warning, no provocation. They were, quite simply, assassinated.
The killings of officers Rafael Ramos and Wen Jianlu emboldened police and their supporters to lash out at weeks of protests. At funeral services for both officers, NYPD officers turned their backs on Mayor de Blasio to display their disapproval of his support for the protests. On March 19th, a New York judge denied the release of Eric Garner grand jury testimony, which had been sought by New York City's public advocate and other groups. And on July 14th, a day after the city comptroller's office announced a settlement had been reached with Mr. Garner's family, more than 100 people gathered in Staten Island for an interfaith prayer service to mark a year since Mr. Garner's death.